Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society's series on British Columbia and Confederation. In this 14th episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series, we look at Foreign Office pressure. The mid-19th century was not a peaceful age. It was a time of uncertain loyalties, rising republicanism, and the slow strategic retreat of the British Empire. To some, these were years of imperial contraction. To others, a long chess match between empires and emerging nations, each move made with quiet intensity and a measured pause. Nowhere was this more evident than in North America, where the Trent Affair of 1861 exposed the fault lines beneath the fragile Anglo-American relationship and accelerated the slow but decisive unraveling of Britain's imperial policy on the continent. In the Trent Affair, the United States Navy stopped a British mail steamer in neutral waters and removed two Confederate envoys bound for Europe. In London, the news struck like a thunderclap. Lord Palmerston, then Prime Minister, called an emergency cabinet and barked, "You may stand for insults to your flag, your honor, your name, but not to your mail packets." Britain mobilized 11,000 troops for Canada. Naval squadrons were dispatched to the Atlantic, and war with the Union hung precariously in the air. Lord John Russell, Foreign Secretary, called it an outrage, and the Times roared that London would not be humiliated by a nation that cannot govern half its own soil. But President Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, released the prisoners with a carefully worded statement. "One war at a time," he reportedly said. The crisis passed. But Britain had seen what war in North America might look like, and the image was not comforting. In its wake, the British Foreign Office grew quietly determined. It would not fight another war to defend the Canadian colonies. London had neither the appetite nor the money to stage a defense of a scattered, vulnerable frontier more than 3,000 miles from home. Under successive foreign secretaries, Russell, Clarendon, and later Lord Granville, Britain's policy hardened into what historian Jed Martin described as a doctrine of imperial disengagement, cloaked in constitutional evolution. Colonies were to become self-governing dominions. They would stand or fall on their own. This philosophy had many dimensions. In fiscal terms, it meant the colonies were expected to pay their own way. The British taxpayer would no longer underwrite roads, railways, or the expensive legal extinguishment of Indigenous title. If the colonies wanted expansion into native-held lands, they could negotiate and pay for that themselves. As historian Philip Buckner wrote, the imperial government had no desire to inherit the moral burden or fiscal cost of frontier conflict. In British Columbia, this policy would resonate bitterly decades later as provincial leaders shouldered the responsibility of negotiating land claims and treaties, issues the Empire had deftly sidestepped.
Amid all the discussions about what should happen to the future of British North America, it becoming a dominion and eventually an independent entity in the growing British Commonwealth, the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office began to exert very, very delicate pressures. Delicate because they were aware of the sensitivities of local persons in British Columbia and the rest of Canada about what should happen for the future. Remember that not all Canadians and British Columbians were keen on the idea of a federation. There was always a residual number who thought this experiment would never work. And the reason they did that was because the idea of a federation was a very, very unique idea in British imperial management. The Federation of New Zealand had failed. The development of Natal and the Federation in South Africa. That also had failed. Later, the Malaysian experiment, it also failed. So the Canadian Confederation arrangements were never always so assured that they would work, and it was an experiment. Lord Carnarvon at the Colonial Office, and then later Lord Granville, who I call the godfather of the Canadian Confederation achievement, were pushing for the possibility that this would come to pass. And Granville says, first of all, we've got to solve the Hudson Bay Company problem, which they do, and then we've got to get the railway going. And we've got to coax all of these parties to move forward.
The San Juan Islands dispute epitomized the new caution, born out of a vague phrase in the Oregon Treaty of 1846. It centered on the water boundary between Vancouver Island and the U.S. mainland. In 1859, an American settler shot a British-owned pig on San Juan Island, and both sides landed troops. Governor Douglas, never shy in asserting British dignity, prepared for military action. But the Foreign Office, under Lord Russell, vetoed escalation. Arbitration, not gunboats, would solve the crisis. British troops camped in the northern half of the island. American forces held the southern end. And there they remained, in a peaceful, ridiculous standoff for over a decade. It would later be resolved, unsurprisingly, in favor of the United States. Douglas, fuming, wrote that British strength, if not its honor, had been compromised. But his words were wind against the tide. London had no interest in war over frontier pigs or rocky islets. The larger fear was strategic and deeply existential. With the United States expanding rapidly westward and still hungry for continental dominance, there was a real belief in Whitehall that all of North America would be absorbed into the American Union if British policy erred. That fear intensified during the U.S. Civil War. The British detested slavery, but viewed the breakup of the Union as a strategic advantage. A fractured United States would be less threatening, but the Union's victory and the rise of a hardened, battle-tested republic with a massive army and global ambitions forced London to reassess. Nowhere was this fear more visible than in the pressure applied to the eastern British colonies, Canada West, Ontario, Canada East, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, in the years surrounding Confederation. The United States had emerged from war stronger than ever. British North American colonies, by contrast, remained disunited, economically weak, and militarily indefensible. As Lord Granville put it in 1867, if war were to come, we would lose Canada in the first fortnight. Canadian politicians understood this perfectly. John A. Macdonald, George Brown, Charles Tupper, and others saw Confederation not only as a political project, but as a defensive necessity. It was, in effect, a continental strategy, a way to fuse the eastern provinces into a single dominion that could claim authority, territory, and a future without relying forever on imperial protection. We must build the nation now, said George Brown in 1864, or we may not hold it at all. London welcomed this logic. Confederation meant cost reduction, risk reduction, and a measure of continued influence without direct control. The colonial secretary, Edward Cardwell, made it increasingly clear that governors were expected to facilitate, not obstruct union. In British Columbia, that pressure would eventually fall on Anthony Mulgrave, who arrived as governor in 1869 with direct, if privately stated, instructions: bring the colony into Canada. His predecessor, Frederick Seymour, had resisted, believing British Columbia could remain imperial and aloof. Mulgrave knew better. The empire wanted out, but on its own terms.
London saw the Dominion of Canada from a different point of view, as did Sir John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and Seymour. And it was quite natural that other people had different points of view on this. The British North America Act of 1867 was the skeleton arrangement for how the Federation was going to work, but the questions remained as to how it was going to function. Was the federal government to have the greatest control with residual powers, or were the provinces to gain these residual powers over the years? And indeed, in the 1930s, the question of resource management came to the provinces, and the federal government had to release those. So the movement towards confederation is a complicated, and I see Granville as the sort of the godfather in all of this, pushing the idea forward, keeping the momentum. And lastly, please recall that although this was sometimes called the era of imperial indifference, there was at the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office and the British ministries no intention of giving up empire, but consolidation of such provinces as British Columbia with the rest of Canada was very much an idea that they continued to press forward. But they wanted self-sufficiency, and there lay in the problem for Canada to be able to develop a self-sufficient economy so that a railway could bring the forged unions from Halifax through to the Pacific.
The ultimate resolution of these tensions came in the form of the Treaty of Washington in 1871, a wide-ranging diplomatic agreement between the United States and Great Britain. Negotiated by Prime Minister William Gladstone's government with the Foreign Office, led by Lord Granville, the treaty resolved the Alabama claims, settled the San Juan Islands dispute, and established a framework for peaceful arbitration going forward. It marked a new Anglo-American détente, an end to a century of skirmishes and suspicion. Crucially, the treaty also confirmed what many already knew: Britain would no longer defend Canada militarily. The Treaty of Washington finalized Britain's strategic pivot, a deliberate imperial withdrawal from confrontation in North America, paired with a quiet endorsement of Canadian nation-building. British Columbia, isolated and encircled, would now have to choose: remain a foreign outpost or join the new Dominion and secure its future on Canadian terms. As historian Carl Berger observed, the British did not so much lose Canada as they deliberately created a Canada that could survive without them. In that light, British Columbia's entry into Confederation was not merely a matter of colonial debate or economic calculation. It was the final act of an imperial strategy, shaped by decades of diplomatic friction, transatlantic anxiety, and global recalibration. It was not the sound of muskets, but the hush of diplomacy, the scratch of pens, and the fading echo of imperial retreat that brought British Columbia into the Canadian fold. The empire, in the end, did not fall, it stepped back, and in doing so, it allowed a new one to rise in its place. Join us next time for Part 15 of the Canada History's 20-part series as we explore new government and change of course. Anthony Mulgrave, the Colonial Office strikes.